the anti-globalisation movement or the alter-globalisation movement. Yeah, I chose this one because I remember reading up on it and being like, oh, this is interesting. I wasn't alive during this time. I want to know more. So, as someone who I believe falls
Yeah.
under the category of geriatric millennial,
Yeah.
do you wish to share?
Thanks for making me feel old.
With love,
Yes,
lots of
this
love.
this was the movement that inspired me, and I became part of maybe the tail end, the mid part of the anti-globalization movement. I've written a whole history, and we'll cover it section by section. I believe next week we're going to do Zapatistas, which is many see the beginning of the anti-globalization movement or the alter-globalization movement, a sort of reaction in rural Mexico to a trade deal, and you're like, a trade deal seems so distant and stuff like that. But let's set the scene. Like, where did this come from? After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism, state socialism in Russia and the Russian Empire, the USSR, and the Eastern Bloc, there was a statement made, this is now the end of history, and another statement made, there is no alternative. There is one order, it's global liberal capitalism. Forget about China and Vietnam, like just global liberal capitalism, nation states, and those nation states are going to slowly be washed away by this process of globalization, and this process of globalization is going to be largely American. So for someone who, like myself, who grew up in the 80s and 90s, one of the things that was really weird about the 80s is I grew up, when I was young, everything was owned by Britain. It was the Royal Mail, like the buses were owned, British Rail was nationally owned, British Gas, British Telecom. You'll recognize these as brand names. They're not brand names. We like, as a nation, owned everything that we needed. And we sold all of those off. And that was already weird. It was unusual. You'd grown up with one common sense, and that was change. But another common sense started to change as well. I used to travel around the country with my dad. We used to work in a lot of different places. And every town, every village, every city was wildly different because everyone had different shops. Everything looked different architecture, different types of people. You started to see that there'd be similar shops and stuff like that. Now, if you go anywhere, everywhere looks exactly the same. And that's not me moaning as an old person. It is a little bit, but it just happens to be a reality. Like, the reality is that globalization, Americanized globalization in that respect, has really reached its zenith. You can't go, like, you can go to the Piazza San Marco in Venezia, in Venice, right? Like, you can go in St. Mark's Place, and you can go to McDonald's, in Venice, on the most famous square in Italy, like one of the most beautiful Renaissance hubs in the world that can ever be seen. And the queues, by the way, for the McDonald's are longer than the queues for the cathedral, in my experience anyways, when I've been there. That's the nature of Americanized globalization. And Europeans like ourselves, but also pretty much everyone everywhere who had their own culture that was not linked, you might have seen one or two American shows and you knew they're the most powerful nation in the world, but you didn't have American stuff everywhere, reacted quite bad to it. So there was quite a cultural reaction. There was also an economic reaction. There was new trade deals. There was ways of screwing over third world countries, as we call them, developing nations or majority world nations, that were being formalized and really bringing them into the liberal order and making sure that they remained basically banana republics. They produced one or two key resources for the global economy and were never able to get out of poverty. And so these concerns ended up meshing and forming a load of different movements. So that backdrop created a bunch of movements. And what we'll cover when we talk about those movements is, ones that happen around the world, but what was the British reaction? And I want to talk about just now, what are some of the key elements that you when we look back on the anti-globalization movement, which is kind of finished for sure. I think the nadir, the end point or the low point would be the Occupy movement in the UK in around about 2012, 2013. And so sort of between 1991 and the end of history in 2013, you have this movement that says, okay, state socialism, Leninism has died. You have the rise of Blair and Clinton and third way social democrats, which are now, as Thatcher said, the greatest achievement was Tony Blair, right? They now totally are neoliberal, liberal, essentially conservative politicians. So there's no route through Leninism to create world change any longer. It feels like there's no hope in that. And actually, the history of those movements in Britain had been failing long before the fall of the Berlin Wall. There doesn't seem to be any route through the ballot box to create change either, to electorally, and this is again across the developed world. So how are we going to create change? And the movements become these things where they say, well, we're going to focus on leaderless movements. You can't corrupt a movement where there are no leaders. And they call them horizontal movements. And these horizontal movements kind of have no memberships, no central committees, no electoral strategy, often no revolutionary strategy in that old Leninist way of like, we're going to, launch a coup, we're going to execute the leaders. It was a lot more about building power from below and getting rid of those tightly controlled, centralized strategies for creating change. What else did they focus on? Direct action was a core feature of anti-globalization movements, not focusing on petitions or demonstrations, but actually acting directly against the powers that were creating the system that was oppressing all of us. If you saw a target, you wouldn't go, well, we're going to write a petition to the local council or to the government or whatever. We're going to demonstrate about this. You go, okay, we need to stop climate change. We'll shut down coal power stations because they're causing it. We're going A to B. We're not going A, Z, B. We're not going to someone else to sort this out because they're not going to, right? And there's a complete lack of faith that someone else was going to sort anything out. And finally, there was a global focus. There was a focus on, we're not going to be able to change things within our own country any longer. We're not going to be able to have a national socialist movement. Leninism and again social democracy are very much focused on changing the government of a particular nation and who was running that nation, whereas the feeling was that's not going to happen. We're in a world where the world is now closely tied together. Things like the internet were starting to happen as well, and so we're becoming more closely tied together. Trade deals tied us together, culturally we're tied together, and economically we are bound together, and we cannot get freedom and a better life and protect the things that we care about unless we work with everyone around the world. And in fact, again, for the British movement, we learned more from the world. We saw ourselves as learners and were inspired by global movements rather than what had maybe happened often previously, people who were to export our ideas of what was best for the world. And that was definitely, a unique feature of the anti-globalization movement.
So we've got horizontal organizing, direct action, and a global focus. Wonderful. And these are going to be recurring themes, obviously, as we explore these ideas. And already I'm thinking to the Zapatistas, the EZLN, and how they work and how these elements obviously are quite integral to Zapatismo as well. But yeah, do you have anything else to add? I have questions, I have thoughts, but I also want to save that for future episodes.
Yeah, I think, we've got so much to explore. When we start talking about the anti-globalization movement, it's going to be fascinating. It's not just like a period in history. This affects every movement. If you want to understand why Corbynism was the way it was, where there was failings, where there's weaknesses, there are massive weaknesses to those things that I was talking about with the anti-globalization movement, as well as many victories actually as well, surprising victories that we don't celebrate enough. So there's going to be so much to learn and celebrate, and Zapatismo and the Zapatistas is a fantastic place to start, and I can't wait to hear that. So yeah, just like, this isn't just an exercise in history, these are stories that not only are part of our lives and movements now, but we're going to help remember the things that helped us win and create change, and also the things that held us back, and try not to repeat those mistakes.
Absolutely. Because yeah, that's the starting point, right? Like, we can, as you said, we can walk and we can talk. I remember since you said that, it stuck with me, because yeah, we can do both. We don't just have to sit in a room and chat about how awful the world is. Let's actually go out and change it, and let's learn from the past, and let's work towards the future.
Yeah, I'd love to claim that as my own, but it's an African proverb. We can walk and we can talk, like, it's a really important thing to think about when you're thinking about movements. There's a section of movements, academics, and God bless people who want to change the world, but a lot of them go into studying it quite deeply and then getting themselves stuck in a silo where they only think about movements and observe them. And then there are other people who are all action, and God bless them for that. Sometimes you are just running at walls, and you need to think about what you're doing whilst you're doing it. And so marrying those two things of learning and doing, yeah, we can walk while we talk, and we can talk while we walk.
Well, thank you very much for that. This has been an enjoyable first episode, and I look forward to next week on Zapatistas, something I will be delving into. Make sure to, follow what we're doing. We're called Breathe Builds on all of our social media, bar Facebook, which has an extra S at the end, but that's due to technical problems.
You're not at all annoyed about that.
But yeah, keep track of what we're doing. Have a look at other work we're doing. A key focus of Breathe's work is again bringing about this change that we seek to create. So yeah, I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful week. In Power, Love and Rage from the Breathe Network.